before I forget, rip to a real one. Frederick Jameson died a couple days ago.
Oh yeah, R.I.P. R.I.P.
Oh, shit.
We always give our RIPs. I think he was like a zillion years old, so lived a good life.
Yeah, for sure. Had an important impact. Yeah.
A very influential life. Yeah.
Yeah.
I do recommend, I'm reading this book at a embarrassingly slow clip, but the Benjamin Files by Jameson, it's looking good. Anyway, what are we talking about today?
I'm a MAGA communist.
You are?
I'm trying to sell you. No, I'm gonna pretend.
Don't hit me with a sword. And where's your suit?
Yes.
Welcome back.
Welcome to the episode when the pill pod turns into MAGA communists.
Turns into it?
Yeah, we're open-minded. Our minds are so open that they're falling out of our head and ain't got much else going on at the moment.
We've been riding that horseshoe all the way to the end.
Yeah.
It's the internet brain slippery slope. It's because we watched the Hegelian e-girls, then J-Reg. So now the boy version of the Hegelian e-girls, it's the logical next step for our internet radicalization.
Yeah, the original, the Hegelian e-boy. Boys.
The Putin shill e-boy council.
We're cresting along the right side.
This is what happens when you don't have a materialist theory of history.
We're on the left side, making the leap to the right side of the horseshoe.
Well, we read Dugin before, and now we read Schmidt. So this seemed like a natural transition, a natural next step. Obviously, we've read Heidegger a lot.
Returning to Heidegger, yeah.
And I want to do this fairly, which means not skipping to the end where all the good stuff is. We're doing a Know Your Enemy podcast.
Exactly.
I guess we are.
And maybe becoming the enemy as we try to understand the enemy.
Staring into the void.
That's why understanding other ideas is so dangerous, because you can become part of it.
Fighting monsters.
There'd be monsters. But yeah, if you are a real man, also lonely, and perhaps most importantly, not gay, we're here to pitch you on MAGA Communism. And if you think that sounds stupid, well, do we have a show for you?
Yeah.
Ironically, or
you might think it's a contradiction, but every contradiction is just a dialectic waiting to happen.
Just a synthesis of opposites. Yeah.
It was philosophical. Went through the entire history of Western philosophy basically on a Twitter thread, which is admirable. It's admirable in its own right.
Ambitious.
Look for a link in the description to that Twitter.
Yeah. If you're bored, you can scroll through 200 tweets. And if you have a life, then we did it for you.
Yep.
It is like a manifesto type of thing, right? But it seems like a response to a very specific charge as well, I guess. But it's very much like written as a manifesto. Yeah,
it's titled Marxism is Not Woke. And then 200, I don't know if you call these aphorism, fragmented thoughts, tweets.
And who?
I mean, it's very of the time to publish your new philosophy via tweet.
And who are we talking about here?
One of the MAGA comms or infrared. I don't know the distinction between those, but the guy's name is HAZ.
And also, he's like the education secretary or something of the Communist Party in the U.S.
Education secretary. That's terrifying. But if my notes are correct, I believe they split from another Communist Party to form a new one recently. But yes, this is their representative intellectual giant.
I'm looking right now at Troll Wiki, which is the proletariat encyclopedia. HAZ described feudal countries, including the Ottoman Empire, Tsardom of Russia, and the Qing dynasty as examples of actual socialism. On a Twitch stream, he claimed the United States is already a socialist country. I mean, I need more context to know what that is, but
well, look, let's not bring in too much outside commentary. Not that we need to, because we have a 200 tweet thread to go through here. And we got plenty of room there to pick the big brain of HAZ. And I've dipped my toe into some of these sources, smearing him for being a stooge and a false Marxist. But yeah, I don't think we need to refer to any of that because we have him in primary source form, and that's bad enough. But basically, we have an ascendancy of thinkers going from Marx to Lenin to Heidegger to Dugin, and finally capping it off with HAZ himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and they're the American Communist Party. You can look at the Twitter of the American Communist Party, and it has their declaration on it, and it's signed by, among others, HAZ and Jason Hinkle and Carlos Garrido. That's from Midwestern Marx, and some other people I don't recognize. But they're really like legitimately building I guess legitimately building a Marxist-Leninist party in America.
I have to show you something. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
This is the documentary where CNN went to a Jackson Hinkle, whatever it is, Communist America Party thing. And this is the CNN reporter. And look who he shakes hands with here.
All right, let's hear it.
Do you recognize that?
Oh wow. one of the Hegelian e-girls, right? I don't know what her name is, but it's one of them. Oh wow, that's funny. Good eye.
A friend of the devil is a friend of mine.
Does she show up later in the documentary like talking, or was that the one shot where you just noticed?
No, it's just that shot. She made it big. CNN.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, you can find.
Well, you use Firefox? That's weird.
Yeah, don't you?
No, I use Chrome. I don't know.
I have only ever used it.
I've kind of always used it. I've always mained Firefox.
You guys have both, like you guys never switched from Firefox to, sorry, this is off topic, but I'm shocked right now. So you're both telling me right now that you made the switch from Internet Explorer to Firefox and then haven't moved since.
Yeah, man.
Incredible stuff. Okay, anyway, sorry, moving on.
Once in a while, I actually use Bing because the text to speech is really good. So I can listen to books and it'll read to me while I do stuff.
Bing has their own browser now, or is it just called like
the Edge browser? Isn't
Edge
it?
browser, right? Yeah, it's Edge browser. I have that.
Yeah, it's got a good PDF reader. It also has the AI voice reading, which is great for me when I'm doing dishes. And
Amazing stuff, guys.
Edging for Edge.
Otherwise, yeah.
Hedging for Edge. Yeah, okay. Anyway, sorry, but MAGA Communism. Anyway, forgetting about
Yeah, new episode.
Did you guys stay with Firefox because of your communism? Because you're like, this is open source. I'm never going to move to those corporate shills at Google.
Yeah, there's definitely some ideological.
Maybe, but I think Firefox gets pretty much all of their money from Google to put Google as the main search browser. But they have good add-ons. That's what I find.
There's some ideological.
Yeah, the extensions and the open sourceness is great.
I remember Firefox being amazing after Internet Explorer, but then it started getting so slow and shitty, and then Chrome came out and it was like lightning fast back then, and then it started getting slow again. But anyway,
I just don't want one company to know everything about me. So if I split up a little bit so that Google doesn't see every search, you know?
No, fair. I get it. It's just I just haven't seen someone actually use Firefox in a while, and it's just amazing that you both do and have this whole time.
I'm on it right now. I used it to go on X to read HAZ's his mega thread on why Marxism is not woke, to let the cat out of the bag.
Yeah, exactly.
I must admit, reading HAZ's manifesto didn't go the way that I was expecting, because I thought, it's Heidegger mixed with Marx. Given what I've heard about MAGA communism and plus the Dugin element, I didn't think it would go in a Marcuse direction. It didn't go in a Marcuse direction.
Okay.
By which I mean using Heidegger for Marxist ends.
Right.
It did mention it, but I think.
Well, my hypothesis coming in, with a name like MAGA Communism plus Dugin, I thought we'd be getting some of the more fashy parts out of Heidegger from this self-proclaimed conservative communist, but I didn't get what I expected, because what we got instead was using Heidegger's critique of metaphysics only to painfully misunderstand it and then hand wave it away in order to reinstitute a new metaphysics, which is then called communism in the final stroke, inexplicably. And I don't know, I was really hoping for something a little more Nazboli, but I didn't really get it here. So Dugin, we've covered him before. Let me just intro spiel to this. Dugin's capturing the minds of 20-year-old men. And 20-year-olds don't have to be 20, by the way. It's a state of mind. It's a vibe. But he's dismissed by detractors as a fascist, and this could be. I suspect his worst crime is being an edgelord. But we read him, and I think we thought it was kind of fashy, like quacks like a duck a little bit. But he says the whole point of the fourth political theory is that he's not a fascist. The fourth political theory is the one after fascism, and the first three are liberalism, communism, fascism, and then the fourth one. And liberalism won in Fukuyama style. It beat out the other two, but now we need a new one, and it's going to be the fourth one, which is not fascist, at least on its face. It might be crypto-fascist. I don't know, Victor, do you think it's a little fashy? I know you don't like when people throw that term around, so is this a...
Well, no, it's not that I don't like it. It's more that I don't like the way that it gets thrown around with a lot of imprecision. I would actually 100% say that it's fashy. And here's why. So I would say that also one of the main claims that Dugin makes, his main critiques of those three political theories, is that they're all tied up in modernism, right? So to him, communism, liberalism, fascism, and I think the way that he thinks about fascism and the way that he tries to be like, oh, this is why I'm not that, is because ultimately his understanding, I think, of fascism is as a very modernist project, as kind of like marshaling kind of production and all these things under a kind of logical organization, but through kind of a centralized rule, kind of under one party. So then you have to kind of ask yourself, okay, well, what's like a non-modern, right? Like what's an anti-modern fourth political theory? Like, what does that look like? I mean, is it fascism? Is it not? Like, I guess the way, if he wants to define it that way, like maybe in some technical sense, if you want to I'm not enough of a scholar of fascism to, give a super clear account of the extent to which I would agree with this idea of modernism and the extent to which classical fascism in the Mussolini sense is modernist. But then you're just like, okay, well, what's anti-modernism, right? So it's like being opposed to everything that I guess modernism is for, I guess technological rationality, right? Some sort of egalitarian ideals. So I don't know whether it's fascism or not. I personally think it's pretty scary.
I think there's a bunch of definitions of modernity, obviously, depending on what discipline you're in. And I think the big one we're working with today is philosophical modernity, which is basically post-Cartesian.
Technological thinking, I think, right?
Well, that's an aspect of modernity, historical modernity, but philosophical modernity refers, I think, quite specifically to the Cartesian philosophical revolution and the birth of science, but also the subject-object split, or I guess Cartesian dualism is a founding moment of philosophical modernity. And then literary modernism is totally different as well. It depends on the discipline you're working with.
But I do think that Dugin is definitely wants to reject probably that kind of modernity. But it's also not just a philosophical modernity, but I think it's also modernity in a kind of moral sense, right? So insofar as moralistic ideas of equal rights and kind of the way that I think what's gone hand in hand with technological modernity and ideas of emancipatory ideals insofar regardless of how well they've been actualized, I think that's also a thing that Dugin is against. Whereas pre-modern morality would have been very hierarchical and kind of
religious, not
religious,
secular.
And each person is in their class and place where they belong kind of naturalistically is, but I guess the story gets complicated because in a sense you could say that Christianity, which is pre-modern, sort of had this idea of everyone being equal in the eyes of God. I don't know, maybe that confuses things a little bit.
I mean, they may be equal in the eyes of God, but you can't have an ordered society unless the families that God has ordained to rule are actually ruling.
Not in the eyes of society. Yeah, you're right. That's an important distinction.
Yeah.
Religion coming back is part of this project for him, I think. And with those first three, the first three are liberalism, communism, fascism. Each has a main problem. I reviewed the fourth political theory because we were doing this today. Liberalism's too individualistic, so we keep some bits of liberalism, but get rid of that. And communism is too materialistic, so we get rid of that and can take some of the good stuff. And then fascism just did it too racistly, so we toned down the racism a bit, and we can reintroduce some elements of fascism.
Yeah, but it sounds like that. But if you think about those three, it's like, which one of those things is, I don't know, most essential to that political ideology, right? Like, I don't know, because it was like the racism party is like, let's just take away the racism from fascism, but keep the rest of it. But what were the other two? I forgot. Like, I kind of
materialism is the problem with communism, and individualism is the problem with liberalism.
Right. Okay. I mean, I would say that the individualism is probably the most crucial to liberalism, whereas, like, you know, I don't think that racism is necessarily essential to fascism.
You know, HAZ is supposedly a Marxist-Leninist, and what I would expect a Marxist-Leninist to say, being amenable to the view, is that fascism is not actually a political ideology at all. It's just capitalism in lockdown mode. Like, from the perspective of a proletarian, qua-proletarian, fascism and capitalism are the same thing.
What HAZ is going to say, and I guess it would be agreed among him and Dugin, is that Western Marxism in particular is kind of just an extension of liberalism, in that it has like this kind of underlying individualism, this methodological individualism, where society kind of isn't real, right? You know, like the Margaret Thatcher thing, you know, there's no such thing as society. There's only individuals and families. It's individualistic. It's an extension of liberalism. It's kind of rad lib shit, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, to get to this, as someone who has, unlike HAZ, spent a lot of time and effort trying to read and understand Heidegger, I probably have more Heidegger books than anyone else.
I still consider
his importance.
Wait, I meant I have more Heidegger books than any other author, not that I have more Heidegger books than anyone else has. To be clear,
you got the best Heidegger books.
All the best.
The biggest
all
Heidegger
the
books.
best books.
Even
all
the
best
lectures.
books. Even the lectures. Covered all of them. I've read them all. I know them all. No one's done it better than me.
What I was hoping this would be is I want to read like some good fashy Heideggerianism. I thought, like, oh, we're doing Schmidt, we can look at that, because this is what Dugin says. And I was figuring HAZ would pick up on this, and he didn't. I was greatly overestimating him. Dugin says this: Dasein is described in Heidegger's philosophy at length via its existential structure, which makes it possible to build a complex, holistic model on its basis, the development of which will lead to, for instance, a new understanding of politics. Now, here's the part. Many researchers have lost sight of the fact that Heidegger, especially in the middle period, 1936 to 1945, developed a complete history of philosophy centered around Dasein, which can form the basis of a full-fledged and well-developed political philosophy in retrospect. Now, I wonder, can you guys guess, why do researchers tend to lose sight of Heidegger's middle period, 1936 to 1945? Why those dates?
I wonder.
I think something was going on. Great Depression.
Despite what he says, that this is where a political philosophy is produced, like, are you reading the books? All Heidegger published, as far as I know, in that period as a book, there's lectures, but as a book, is the Nietzsche books. And he doesn't cite those, so far as I know. He cites Question Concerning Technology. He cites Introduction to Metaphysics. He cites Logos, which is the Heraclitus lecture from the late period, and then Being in Time. So it's all middle, or all early and late. And he says, oh, but the middle has some good stuff. So I was assuming that he was not going to talk about the Nietzsche book, which he does not. But the most Nazi shit in there is, of course, the Rector et Strata, which is the most blood and soil, German spirit, follow the Führer stuff. And that actually kind of seems to jive with, you know, every nation, and Greater Eurasia has its own spirit and shit like that. So I was hoping that HAZ would pick up on that, so I would have something to a challenge to overcome. But unfortunately, no. Honestly, I have no idea what Dugin is saying with the great political texts that are not read from the middle period.
Yeah, I'm not really sure.
And
either.
a lot of that is available, I guess, to read, but either published as collections after. And I hear Heidegger's son edited
Yeah.
a lot of his work too. And the Heidegger estate is very slow to release things or give people permission to look in the archives. Which, like, that guy Richard Wolin is one of the more famous people, I guess, who's working on Heidegger and how deeply tied his philosophy is to Nazism. Obviously, Being in Time was published before these sorts of things were blowing up, but then later on he went into the Nazi party, never apologized.
But during the war, it's like
that.
I said, it's the Nietzsche books, then the Holderlin lectures, when he tries his hand at poetry, some Schelling stuff, some Greek stuff, but it's not expressly political. So I'm not sure what the great stuff there that everyone's missing is that's specifically political, unless he means the self-assertion of the German university.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I have a book here, Heidegger's lecture course on Parmenides at Freiburg from 42 to 43. So I get that would be a weird lecture to go to. Hey, you know how there's like some war going on? Let's go to school and learn about Heidegger's interpretation of Parmenides instead. If you've got nothing else going on, I'm doing some lectures, everybody. But that was during this period.
So we're gonna get to HAZ's Heidegger and HAZ's Dugin. I just thought, I'd expect a little bit more here, but HAZ, who's HAZ?
Yeah.
Bit of a wild card. He's not an idiot. I don't think a true idiot could have put this together. Although maybe someone who is not an idiot would not have put this together and tweeted it. But what do I know?
Yeah, that's true.
just the right mixture.
I mean, in 200 tweets, he only said LGBT once. So I guess that's pretty impressive for him. An accomplishment in its own right.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, even though it's like part of the title, or I guess it's implied in why he's saying Marxism is not woke, because people like James Lindsay and people he calls rightists, which I guess I use that term as well.
Mm-hmm.
James Lindsay, probably, you could think of Peterson, cultural Marxism, all those accusations that like, that you just have these like leftist cultural Marxists hanging off the campus roofs, yelling about Palestine and LGBTQ issues. He's trying to argue against all that, saying, no, Marxism is not woke. It's actually tough as shit. And I'm going to say that, but we only need to just like fundamentally renovate the conceptual architecture of Marxism using Dugin and Heidegger. Just little changes, and that like really brings to the fore how it's not woke at all. Is that all? Okay, cool. Let's go 217 paragraphs. Let's see how it's done.
Pro-Western civilization, which is for sure not gay, whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh well, as a Marxist yourself, recently come out of the closet, Eric. I don't know how many times I'm going to say that. It was a month and a half ago. Are you? How close are you? How close are you to MAGA communism?
Yeah, how is this landing? How's this landing to your Marxist ears?
I'm still on my journey, and I like a little more explanation. These are claims, and I'm not sure. I just found myself just like, okay, and then I just started reading like Capital, because the new translation is out. Capital, right. Translated by Paul Reiter. First new one. So I was reading some of that. And honestly, it's hard to go from what he's saying in here to what Marx is actually writing. I was just reading, no commodity makes its way to the market or is exchanged for other commodities without help. We need then to consider the keepers of commodities, commodity owners, and so on.
Right.
Marx is in Capital more so, he's just very systematic and technical, invents expressions to describe what he's talking about, relations of production and abstract labor. Yeah, it's always strange to me to get into the sort of, philosophical underpinnings of Marx, because that stuff is, early Marx.
I have a Marxist question. So, like Heidegger. Marx has his own stages of thought. He tries his hand a lot more at philosophy when he's younger, and then that gets de-emphasized as he gets older, opting for a kind of, I don't know, boots on the ground analysis. So do you think that from beyond the grave, that Marx would be fine with Marxism still being conflated with the humanism and the Hegel and philosophy stuff, or should Marxist analysis follow Capital's example and do a style of technical or sociological analysis?
Well, oh my God, like it's a huge debate, right? So clearly, you know, you have Louis Althusser, the famous French Marxist, who sided with, well, I guess you make that distinction between the young Marx or the early and the late Marx. And then you pick a side, and Althusser picks the sort of side of the late Marx. And then you have other people questioning that, like, you know, then it becomes this debate about like the continuity of Marxist thought. And, you know, I don't really have a stake in all of that, except to say, you know, yeah, sure, like Marx's early theories of alienation, like he doesn't talk about that a lot in Capital, but it seems to be there, just sort of, you know, articulated amongst a bunch of different concepts. And he doesn't use those like 4 types of alienation in any, like, he doesn't present them as he does in his like 1844 work, which is like 20 years before Capital. So, you know, that's academic, that question.
Interesting. I ask because HAZ, I think, calls himself a Marxist. There's something to do with Marx there anyway. But there's a tendency among philosophers, modern philosophy particularly, to set out with this theory of everything, which means you have to start with the beginning. We need to start with the dawn of being and establish a foundation. And then from the foundation, we're permitted to build a theory slowly, layer by layer. Hegel looks like that. Husserl looks like that. Heidegger kind of looks like that and then does something else. But it's very architectural. It's really obsessed with origins and structures and grounding all the layers all the way up. And the latent fear there seems to be, if we don't start with foundations, then the structure will fall over or implode. Like, they take the analogy too seriously. This seems like a neurotic tendency of philosophers that Marx himself got over, because who the fuck cares? Who the fuck cares if being is singular or multiple? It's an unanswerable question anyway, and even trying to answer it means you have way too much time on your hands not doing something useful. Anyway, if we move on to some actual text here, want to do that?
I was thinking we could maybe talk, like, zoom out and be like, you know, what is MAGA communism? Like, what is, you know, I feel like I was actually thinking about this today, and I was like, maybe I can kind of give my account from the perspective of a MAGA communist, right? Like, what am I trying to do here?
Nice. Okay, let's have it.
You know, there's a lost potential in the American working class right now. There's something appealing about looking at things from ordinary people, right? Like, who are these ordinary working class people, right? They are being pulled. There is something that a Trump-ish figure is saying that is appealing to them. And there are things that we can find in common with a broadly Marxist orientation, which is skepticism and suspicion of the elites, of, you know, the establishment, of an establishment that all it wants to do is maintain like neoliberal capitalism, stagnant wages, and not actually helping the working class, right? Both the Democrats and like the classical Republicans have always been really just the handmaiden and a Trump figure. And what we're seeing is like an energy, like kind of trying to release itself with a frustration. And if all we see from the Trump movement, if all we see is just the racism and the anti-immigrant sentiment, and don't actually see that it's coming from a place of like working class frustration, then we're missing something. And I think that MAGA communism is trying to bring those things together, to channel that energy from, you know, from all these like blue collar working class people, and, you know, synthesize and unite, and that like that the goal is really, and I think what these, you know, as MAGA communists want to bring these people on board and show them. Now, obviously, so that's I think that is the MAGA communist pitch, I think.
I guess the argument of MAGA communism is, yeah, to capture the this discontent among the working classes and some of that anti-establishment energy that has been revealed to be out there, but is currently being capitalized by the far right, and the far left is simply all of the left is simply doing a extremely miserable job trying to harness that.
And what they're doing instead they're scolding. Instead they're scolding all those people who like Trump, right?
Yeah, they're too afraid to stray away from the liberal consensus, even though it's collapsing around them, and yet they sense that something needs to change, and that there's a lot of discontent out there that could be used, but for moral reasons, perhaps is not being used.
Okay, that's a nice on-paper description. One could argue, perhaps, given everything you've just described, that the MAGA part of this is just superfluous, because, of course, everything you've said about, I'll put it into the other terms, I guess, contradictions are being concretized such that the working class is realizing their immiserated state relative to where the money and power actually is. And all that's already predicted by the communism part of MAGA communism. The MAGA edition seems merely to be, we also want to be not woke, not gay, say slurs, and do masculineness, in the most performative way. We want to wear suits to meetings. We might say that in an ideal scenario, if this were that, it's a 4D chess branding exercise so that the not woke, desperate to be masculine 20-year-olds are seduced into class consciousness because, hey, we can say all the cool slurs too. But I guess we have to answer still, is that actually what's happening? Or is this
that remains to be seen.
A wannabe e-boy movement?
Well, that's a different question. That's a different question because, on the left, again, we say, all these issues, like besides class, you have, race and sexual orientation and gender identity. And all these things are just, divisions that the elites are trying to foist onto the masses in order to keep us divided and fighting each other so that we don't actually come together and see the real threat to our existence, which is the fucking capitalists.
Exactly.
But then this sort of, that would be just like a question I want to keep track of is this anti-LGBT sentiment that HAZ and a lot of these MAGAs are articulating, does that fit with that? That seems very divisive. Like it's just going to be a non-starter.
Here's the way that, again, I'm going to try to channel the MAGA communist energy here and try to give an account of how I think that maybe fits in.
You're talking to Soy. You have to yell.
Yeah, I like this role playing. I like it.
These fringe sexual identities are not things that ordinary people care about or want to be put in front of their faces. So it's a strategic blunder as a left to be obsessed with making sure that there's all this inclusion stuff that's just going to marginalize, the 85 to 90% of people who don't care, who just want good jobs and good paying jobs. So from a strategic perspective, I think a MAGA communist would be let's just say maybe that shit's weird. And then it'll be oh yeah, ordinary people will be oh yeah, okay. So maybe that's, by the way, this is not my view. I want to make that 100% clear. I'm just saying that's, I think, kind of the idea. It's it's the liberal consensus is pushing these fringe identities that are elitist in nature, that come from elitist academia, and it is marginalizing the everyday ordinary working person in middle America, and that's a mistake.
Well, since we have our strategic thinking caps on, what's really going to reach out to the immiserated working class in America?
What?
A 200 tweet thread about the existential analytic of Dasein combined with an esoteric Eurasian nationalist as the solution to the immiseration of the working class.
Exactly. And also, I should also be 100% clear now, not being from the MAGA communist perspective. Trump is also obviously fucking lying to you. He is not at all interested in the war. That's the biggest flaw in MAGA communism, is that Trump is going to sell you out every single time. He's going to sell you out to rich interests every single fucking time. So
Do they actually want to vote for Trump, or is that just the CNN?
No, they do.
CNN documentary said they do want to vote for Trump.
Yes, because I think they think that Trump is actually like means what he says when he talks to the working class, but that's obviously just absolute horseshit.
I've been wrong before in my overestimation of the basic level of human intelligence, but I can't actually believe that they believe that.
I don't know if it's about voting for Trump so much as, you know, like Hillary Clinton's famous like basket of deplorables quip, right? Which seems to just sort of put any kind of effort to reach whatever Trump's MAGA base is just off limits. Like it's like offside. You can't appeal to these people because of some kind of moral or ideological purity issues, right? And so I don't know, to be charitable, yeah, it just seems like they're transgressing these politically correct norms on purpose in order to reach this MAGA base, saying, you know, yeah, like we're there with you. We think that well, these are HAZ's words, right? LGBT bourgeois degenerates and the Soros backed Black Lives Matter stuff. Like that's how he refers to that stuff.
Well, that's the nicest terms he's used. I've heard him and Hinkle say some other terms.
Yeah, those are okay. Those are the nicer way. It only gets worse from there. And yeah, it's like don't vote for Trump. Okay, maybe not, but you know, we're going to use this rhetoric and demonize certain types of people in order to be appealing to a certain section of society who feels left behind and the left is not offering any alternative.
I kind of think we might be being unfairly charitable here, but it seems to me that if the American working class is the goal, it's at best in third place on their list of goals. The first two are being anti-woke and masturbating to Putin and China, at least in Hinkle's case. So if the American working class is taking at best the bronze here, and just in case there's some loyal ACP soldiers who have found their way here, here's my marketing idea for you guys. When Heidegger became a Nazi, he started going on about the destiny of the German people and romanticizing this image of the Bavarian farmer writing poetry out in the rolling hills. So if you want to switch to some positive messaging, forget about pronouns, just forget about trans people entirely. Try your hand at something creative instead of annoying. Like, I want a picture. Give me an image of a strong, erotic, sweaty, blue-collar dad who goes to church because his wife makes him.
Yeah, exactly.
He doesn't need laser eyes. He doesn't need to be punching Hillary Clinton or a guy wearing nail polish. Just go for some positive Volk vibes, maybe.
Those images are definitely there. Those like romanticizing kinds of working class American images.
I don't know if this is picking up. Anyway, I didn't read these 200 tweets for nothing. So we have to go through these.
Yeah, let's get to it. I'm
going to just summarize through them, but please interrupt me if you need to. Otherwise, I'll just basically do the summary.
And if you want to be really thorough before you listen to this, you can just go listen to one of like James Lindsay's recent takes on Marxism, and that'll show you what HAZ is responding to. Basically, it all starts with Hegelianism, I think, for Lindsay. Fast forward.
Everything after Hegel is Gnosticism trying to destroy Christianity and also destroy Western civilization. I don't know who even James Lindsay likes. Jesus.
yeah. And
well, he's like
Alan Sokol.
He's like a weird like right wing liberal. I think he's kind of like this weird old school kind of like anti woke.
He's one of the dumbest people I've ever heard speak. So
yeah, he's super dumb. He's pretty incoherent.
Yeah, but that's their shtick anyway, and that's what HAZ is getting angry at.
Because he doesn't want to be called woke. Being called woke is worse than being called a fascist.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm starting around section 70 because the first 70 are talking to James Lindsay. So I just was going for the Heidegger stuff. And this is how Heidegger is going to save Marxism from itself, or Western Marxism.
I have to mention too, in that within that first 70, there are some ideas I've come into contact with, saying, there's this distinction between Western Marxism, whose founder is Georg Lukács. One of the founding texts is History and Class Consciousness. And then there is Marxist-Leninism and Stalinism, which I think these guys are in that camp too. Like, HAZ and Hinkle and all the Midwestern Marx people and whatever. I think they're also on this more on the Eastern communist Stalinist side. And the big thing they picks out anyway, is that Lukács, rejects Engels and the dialectics of nature, which means cutting off, the natural world. Like, this is put out of bounds for any kind of dialectics, and they think this is completely wrong. And it is kind of wrong in general that Lukács rejected that. It's just like in one footnote that he kind of criticizes Engels, and then he walks that back in various ways later in his career. But anyway, then in number 30, he says, in other words, James Lindsay is a fucking moron when he blames wokeism's metaphysical distrust in reality on Marxism. In actual fact, the distrust in reality is the very basis of bourgeois modernity. It can be thought of as the entire premise of the Age of Enlightenment itself.
Oh my God. Don't break your back, dude.
So that distrust in reality, comes from Western Marxism, the subject-object dialectic that Lukács tries to deal with, and putting nature off bounds for the application of dialectical thinking, which here stands as part of reality. And so you're rejecting part of reality if you're not willing to think dialectically.
Man, poor Descartes. You fucked up when the Deleuzian breakdancer hates you and HAZ hates you.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, the most productive disagreement. The most productive guy to hate.
Poor Descartes. He's just sitting there in his weird wig, just trying to figure out what the clear and distinct ideas are and not erect a foundation that can be doubted. This is a salt of the earth pursuit, but the way people talk about him, you think he would Mengele or something.
Mm-hmm.
But more to the point, you'd have to be historically illiterate to either claim that any sort of philosophical anti-realism is particular to Enlightenment or bourgeois philosophy, or that it wasn't always part of philosophy.
No, because we also looked at, God, I'm sorry, we got to get back to it, but we also watched HAZ interview Dugin and ask a question. And Dugin goes into this, right? The history of Western philosophy, right? Which is relevant, I guess, for understanding what Heidegger is talking about, because this is the whole Western metaphysical tradition, beginning with the ancient Greeks and running through medieval Europe, and then through the modern period with Descartes and the rationalists and empiricists and so on and so forth. So Plato would be, I guess, a conceptual realist, right? The belief, this whole debate in the Middle Ages, which Dugin didn't really do the greatest job of articulating, but it was about the medievals debating on the reality of universals. And if you know anything about the history of Western thought, the nominalists, not the scholastic realists, and not the conceptualists, but the nominalists, the ones who believe that only individuals are real, and that anything that we think is universal, like what is a cup? There's some kind of universal cup that all the cups possess some cupness of. Those are just words or thoughts or similarities that our minds sort of, you see the similarities in your head and you put a name on that similarity. And so nominalism is like nameism. And, Occam, Willem of Occam becomes a very important figure.
You have the medieval debates, you have Greek debates. If you look to Schopenhauer, he talks about how there's a anti-realist trend in ancient Indian philosophy that goes back like 4,000 years. But no, it's all bourgeois. Bourgeois are anti-realist.
Well, yeah, bourgeois wouldn't really be a category that emerges until capitalism is developed, right? The bourgeois would just be like the city merchants at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. This is a particularly nonsense claim made in full confidence, and it will not be the last. So if we hustle through the first 70 tweets or so here, eventually we arrive at Marx, who gives communism an intellectual form, and then he needs Lenin to make it concrete. And that was outside the West. So Russia is not included in the West here. Not exactly sure how that works. Also, logos is not a Western term. Also, not exactly sure how that works. But we have to make communism meaningful in the West. And we can't do that with any Western philosopher except for Heidegger, because before Heidegger, everything is just bourgeois metaphysics. And Heidegger frees the Western mind from bourgeois metaphysics.
Yes. Metaphysics is the great enemy here.
But how does Heidegger defeat bourgeois metaphysics? Because he wants to begin with ontology rather than beginning with metaphysics. And Marx, HAZ says, rejected idealism and then reintroduced metaphysics in terms like man, class, mode of production, etc. And this is metaphysical, I suppose, because it maintains a distinction between subject and object, whereas Dasein in the existential analytic is supposed to precede that distinction. And I think we're pretty much up to speed on that. That's basically a Wikipedia summary of being in time. That's the purpose. That's why it's called Dasein, not subject. And it's staged here. This is what's a novel production here, is that Heidegger's coming to rescue Marxism in Haz's mind. Marcuse had a similar project as a young man. And this is, I should say, this is kind of a standard critique of Marxism by philosophers specifically, is that it doesn't have a robust philosophical foundation, that it inverts capitalism but remains like within the categories with respect to the objectivity of the world. And that's why actually we spent some time studying sociologists and anthropologists trying to get at value distinctions that predate use value, like alternative models of society that are not just labor nature society. Anyway, that's good. I've definitely heard I've heard worse conference presentations than Haz's take on this bit, at least.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah. This is where, he starts setting up where Heidegger is going to come in, right? Because number 70, we're skipping all over the first 70. He says, Marxism succeeded in overcoming metaphysics, but only within the limited scope of practice. So you don't have an overcoming of metaphysics. That was end quote. You don't have an overcoming of metaphysics with thinking, I guess. You just have it with practice, right? Marxism is a practical philosophy, a praxis-based philosophy, right? So that's one point. Marxism overcomes metaphysics, but only in practice. And then not that pesky Western Marxism either, the true Marxism, which was preserved by Lenin and Marxist-Leninism and eventually Stalinism. So true Marxism goes east, and Western Marxism degenerates into bourgeois liberalism. And so I suppose Heidegger's going to come along and give us a much better idea about how exactly Marxism overcame metaphysics, but only in practice, and how we can extend that overcoming of metaphysics into our thinking. And so we need this Heideggerian, if you know anything about Heidegger, you know that he's got this great vocabulary to go along with his philosophy. So this analytic of Dasein, of being there, and, the difference between being as such and beings in the plural, and him really driving into what he calls the ontological difference there. And all Western metaphysics is a forgetting of that difference and a forgetting of the question of being and just focusing on the beings, plural, and never really asking the question of being, even though it's so deeply important to Dasein. It is so very important, this question of being, but it's just papered over and forgotten by the Western metaphysical tradition.
Basically, up until 104, he's more or less reading the first 3 sections of Being and Time. I don't know if you guys picked up on that.
Yeah.
Anyway, insofar as HAZ is concerned, Heidegger is overcoming the subject-object division, and
Yes.
this is not HAZ's take. This is every person who's amenable to Heidegger's positions.
Well, we all agree that that's what he was trying to do, right? And there's obviously disagreement about how successful he was. And he talks a lot about Dasein as being like both, like as not reducible to like an individual subject, but not also reducible to like collectivity that it somehow contains. It's like he calls it a precursor or like a precondition for like individuality or collectivity to exist. And I don't know, like I can't remember. It's been too long since I actually like really extensively read Being and Time. But did that seem right to you guys?
Which part?
Like the claim that there's like that individual, that Dasein is not pointing to a single individual. I think I agree with that.
Yeah.
Well, it's not it's neither individual
exactly.
nor social,
nor collective, nor social. Yeah. He calls HAZ says it's a precursor. It's like a precondition for either to emerge.
Yeah, it's like a background against which Dasein comes into. Like there's the there being, the being in the middle, and then there's the thing you're sort of in the middle of, right? There's the there being, and then there's like, what is this being that they're in the middle of? And that's
exactly
kind of what the questioning is about. But that's what I thought the opening gambit, I have my copy of Being in Time. The opening gambit is this question has today been forgotten. Although our time considers itself progressive in, again, affirming metaphysics. And metaphysics is in quotation marks there. And that's that, like, since Plato, that question of being has been forgotten. Plato sort of articulated it, but it gets buried in the foundations of Western philosophy.
I guess he tries to find it in language later on, rather than in the existential phenomenological.
Yes. Yeah, there's something of a linguistic turn at some point there. Yeah. And language becomes that's why he becomes like even more, he comes at it from all these different angles later on, because he thinks like even language itself is implicated in this question. And I think he has a sense of that even from the beginning, which is why he's coming up with this vocabulary. He's not like Marx coming up with a new vocabulary, where Marx is trying to articulate like a non-bourgeois view of economics. He's like Heidegger's doing something with the philosophical tradition, so he needs a different language for that because we're so steeped in it. He needs to almost shock us out of it with these strange hyphenated in English. I'm sure they're just normal words in German because that's how they work.
So I can see the general shape of HAZ's very luxurious philosophical problem here. And although it's not precisely articulated, do you see this problem, Eric? Like if Marxism doesn't have a phenomenological basis of the distinction between identity and world, and he wouldn't, because, phenomenology proper was invented by Husserl. But even if Marxism didn't have that, doesn't start at the being of beings, is it clear that that's a problem for Marxism? Would this be inimical to a Marxist project at all?
Yeah, I didn't read everything carefully here, but I did not also get a sense of why it's problematic, except we have this example of Western Marxism, which sort of, I guess, is like the proof in the pudding that we need to overcome the metaphysical tradition. Even Marx did it, but like the next one after I read, number 71, proposition number 71, says Marx and Engels failed to fully transmit their theoretical genius. So they failed to fully transmit that overcoming of metaphysics that they articulated, except Lenin. Lenin alone inherited it and gave it practical reality.
This is such a weird quasi-spiritualism. Like Lenin did the Russian Revolution by himself with his ideas.
And then he says next, the genius of Marxism survived as the genius of world historical statesmen and civilizations, but its original spark of consciousness was lost. So it got preserved. Yeah, statesmen and civilizations. So that's those things come in to become very important, especially civilizations, right? Because that's more where Dugin comes in. But you first of all, we're already dealing with Western civilization and the metaphysical thinking that permeates Western civilization, and so we need to get out of that first, and then Dugin comes in and like sort of broadens the picture a little bit. But basically, yeah, grafting Heidegger onto Marx is the first step, or grafting Marx onto Heidegger. I'm actually not sure which way it's going.
I fail to see the point, but no matter, I guess. After this, literally everything he says about Heidegger is wrong. It seems to me that he read some sort of summary on the first 3 chapters of Being in Time and then stopped.
It's funny. The point is Marxism is not woke. Let's always come back to that.
But like
we're doing fine as long as we're not gay and trans.
We're just really deep in the weeds. We forgot the shore that we left on. But it's Marxism isn't woke.
Well, there's a glaring inefficiency here. And we know that fascists love efficiency, so this is just bad fascism. But instead of using the fasci nation spirit mysticism that Heidegger deploys, instead he's going to correct pre-fascist Heidegger and say that he's wrong, and then instead just get the nation spirit mysticism from Dugin instead. Like you could have just kept with Heidegger and got it from the source, you know?
Are you talking, I was just looking at aphorism, I think it's 107, where he kind of says...
107 is where it gets egregious, Heidegger, but let me introduce his term.
Okay, yeah, it gets ridiculous.
Heidegger's shortcoming lies in the ambiguity of Dasein. While Dasein, and yeah, is that ambiguous? It's painstakingly plotted out from Dasein's first awakening,
yes, Exactly. It's a whole book to try to make it not ambiguous. That's actually what the whole book is about.
There's 300 pages on it. Anyway, Dasein is thrown into a given community as an established horizon of being. It acquires an authentic relation to being only through the exercise of individual will, where it comes to acknowledge its finitude. Yet at the same time, the community is the very ground of Dasein, since one's relation towards others constitutes a given, conventionally established horizon of being. What remains ambiguous is the antisocial status of the being which discloses itself to Dasein. So I don't want to miss this, because there's several sleight of hands packed into this little transition. There's terms introduced, community for the first time, and he's going to rely on community for the rest of the paper because he wants to
communism,
right? And the anti-socialness of being. So this just makes me think why I said he only read 3 chapters is because chapter 4 and I think 5 are all on Mitsein, which is with being, and language, and how language functions as this, or there's a logos of concrete language that functions as the explication or the revealing of being to beings. And this is part of the essential sociality of Dasein. And HAZ decides that, no, this is antisocial and individualistic, so we need to go to Dugin. But then we get into some very, very bizarre statements, like Heidegger does not make it clear how it is community. Oh, I didn't misread that. Heidegger does not make it clear how it is community acquires singularity of being. He grounds phenomenological being the site of its conceivability.
Yeah, how it is that
there's a bunch of typos there, but
yeah, I mean, this is just straight. Even what he's trying to say, it's straight up wrong, because taking the self-other distinction from unconcealment, it's already concretized in speech, which is the most cited, the most important part, regarded by pretty much anyone who reads this book, of Heidegger's, what he actually changes from previous phenomenologies is this introduction of language as the unconcealing. I begrudge having to open this fucking book because it's a tome, but he says, section 33, tell me if this sounds antisocial. Hearing constitutes the primary and authentic openness of Dasein for its own most possibility of being, as in hearing the voice of a friend whom every Dasein carries with it. As being in the world that understands with others, it listens to itself and to Mitdasein, and in listening belongs to these. And then after that, there's 40 more pages of just speech and unconcealment. So again, there's been thousands of pages, maybe thousands of books written on this. But no, HAZ doesn't have time for that. He just says, Heidegger's understanding of metaphysics is the very chief defect of this book, not only condemning it to stagnation on his part, but placing it at risk of idealism.
Yeah, that's good. That's a great,
Yeah, which is another big enemy, right? Idealism, the enemy of materialism, which becomes idealism and metaphysics are kind of now linked here.
Yeah.
If you're an idealist, you're also sort of steeped in the metaphysical tradition. Yeah, it's strange that he accuses Heidegger of being ambiguous about the sociality of Dasein.
Yeah.
Especially in light of that quote. But I'm guessing this sort of then must parallel something that happens to the Marxist tradition, at least in the hands of the Western tradition, right? Because he says, Marxism, Leninism emerged as a type of phronesis, which means like wisdom. It's like an Aristotelian term, whose advanced outlook was established by the context of the concrete historical experience of communism, not strictly a matter of theoretical intellect, but also a type of advanced sensibility based on practical reality. Okay, so this is where it is preserved. Whereas in the West, it needs to be, for it to be meaningful in the West, for Marxism to be meaningful in the West, it can't ignore this problem of metaphysical thinking. For when it does, it remains trapped within it, inevitably regressing materialist objectivity from practical scientific socialism. If you don't have that basis, then it slides back into Kantian scholasticism or Spinozist.
Yeah, this is actually where HAZ's theory completely implodes. It's a self-annihilating critique, I think. Maybe I'm confused. or maybe it's his cause and effect that's just so contorted depending on his emotional reaction to whatever he likes and dislikes. So the revolution happened in the USSR because Lenin had the good ideas. And it didn't happen in the West because the ideas were corrupted, or maybe the CIA bought off the intellectuals or whatever the fuck they say. This is from the material conditions people, though. Now, tell me how the ideas getting corrupted could have had such a detrimental effect, at least to the point where that's the only thing you talk about vis-a-vis Western Marxism. And now we're even taking that absurdity a step further by saying that the good ideas of all people belong to Heidegger and Dugin, and that these are the ideas that will now save Western Marxism from the bad ideas. All right, so I guess we're not doing material conditions, we're doing ideas as causal. Now, fair enough. I accept that. I like that. That's my zone. But now Heidegger is guilty of idealism in 108.
Yeah.
For what? I'd be quick to jump on idealism. I avoid it to the best of my ability, and I call Heidegger a mystic whenever he falls into it. But he doesn't fall into it here. To say that human sociability emerges with language, with literal hearing and literal speech, non-abstracted speech. I'm not nitpicking him here. This is a major misreading of Heidegger, and it's a major misreading of the shift that Heidegger introduced into philosophy. But even if he wasn't wrong about it, this doesn't fit into his stated project.
Yeah. No, it's good. This is also making me want to read like some Dugin on Heidegger. Like it'd be interesting to see, like, do you think HAZ is getting this wrong from his own misreading, or is he getting it wrong via Dugin? Like, because I've actually heard some people tell me, like some real academics tell me that like there's actually some stuff that apparently Dugin writes about Heidegger that's pretty interesting. So, I don't know.
in this little interview question that Haas got to ask one question and Dugin just answered for half an hour. The one part where I would say, because he wants to talk about logoi, the plural of logos, not being singular, where it's quite important for Heidegger that it is singular because it's prior to distinctions. And then Dugin quickly says right after, Heidegger wouldn't like that I'm doing this. So that's all I know.
Well, I think that's where it comes in, right? So Heidegger was kind of ambiguous about Dasein. We didn't bring in logos, but basically, Dasein, logos manifests being as Dasein. I don't know the right words to use there, but basically, yeah, the logos has this singular beginning, I guess, for Heidegger in the Western tradition, like with the ancient Greeks. Whereas for Dugin, it becomes like plural, like any civilization is sort of founded on this moment where the logos is born or is manifested. So you have this civilizational kind of argument coming in. So I don't know, I guess, the Western, that's kind of what Dugin says, is that for Heidegger, he's Eurocentric. Anything outside of the Western metaphysical tradition doesn't quite articulate any true questioning of being. Only the Western tradition does, and then kind of immediately abandons it. Whereas for Dugin, you have Russian civilization, for example, right? So you can see why Dugin a few years ago, all those articles coming out saying, he's the state philosopher of Putinism and stuff like that, because of, the manifest destiny kind of stuff of the Russians, the destiny to whatever, take back the old empire, invade Ukraine and all that shit. So you have this sort of civilizational logos framework now. So you need multiple origins instead of just one.
Which sounds nice, except it's just nothing to do with what Heidegger said logos was. So I assume here we need an American logos, and HAZ is going to shepherd it into being.
Yeah, that would be the MAGA communism, I guess, manifests that. Right, yeah. that American logos.
Coors Light logos.
Yeah, that real American logos. That's not, it's like, trans and gay. That's just not part of the logos.
Not that dirty liberal universalist Western Marxism. No, it's something particular, right? Because that's what he says this too. Dugin particularizes logos, where exactly. Heidegger kind of leaves it as this amorphous kind of all.
Yeah, exactly. That's where I think that's also, I remember when I was reading it thinking that, I remember when I was reading Being in Time, my insight was, my takeaway would be that then to say that there are particular Daseins that reflect a culture, I was that sounds super weird to me. I'm like, that's not the point that he's making.
Yeah, that's Heidegger spent all this time trying to demetaphysicalize. And then we're just like, no, we're actually going to put divisions in there, and it's going to be based on where you live.
Yeah, there's Eurasian Daseins. I was like, that's just the opposite of the insight that I feel like I got from that book.
Maybe Dugin gives a good argument for it, but it's certainly not found in HAZ's Dugin. But for in his transition from Heidegger to Dugin, because Heidegger fails to introduce a plurality of logoi, but then he gives, I think this might be the worst 2-sentence summary of any philosopher that I've ever heard and ever read. He says,
"What aphorism is that?" I want to follow along.
Let me find it.
The Ig Nobel Prize goes to
109. It's 109.
Find it.
109. Heidegger makes no distinction in his understanding of metaphysics between being in the specificity of its determination and being in the specificity of its understanding within the history of philosophy. Now, this might sound like, oh, what's the big deal? This is literally Heidegger's entire career. For the specificity of being first via phenomenology, then the second half of his career is spent reading Aristotle, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Kant, Schelling, the entire history of philosophy, Occidental philosophy. We could also include the non-negligible interactions with Japanese Buddhist philosophers, and then writing a two 500-page books on Nietzsche attempting to undo metaphysics, and then turning to poetry and weird shit and pre-Socratic Greeks trying to recover thinking. Like, first of all, that's a huge distinction between the being in time analytic, which he was going to write a second part and decided not to because he didn't think the problem was solvable via that route anymore. So then he turned to the entire history of Western philosophy. But no, HAZ, with no fucking clue, is just gonna decide all that has ever happened in the world based on his hormonal changes, apparently.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
that's so. Yeah. It's so funny. It's so funny that he makes claims. Then you're just like, well, if you look, Heidegger was actually doing the exact opposite of what you're claiming.
Yeah, you might as well just say the exact opposite thing, and you have an equal chance of being right. Victor, since you thrownness from being in time, it's kind of one of your things. Here's one for you. Another HAZ banger. The absolute contradiction is a contradiction of incipience between determination and origins. The contingency of Dasein is not simply a matter of choice, as Heidegger thought.
Oh my God. So bad. God, I hope he gets mad at us and yells at us.
Well, he's going to challenge you to a duel or something. Well, like, we started off okay. Like, you've heard of thrownness, the most basic, fundamental aspect of Dasein's experience of time. Thrownness, no, it's choice.
Yeah, that's bizarre. That's a bizarre interpretation. And again, I'm so curious: is this coming from Dugin or is this him? Like,
it can't be. It can't. If you had finished the Wikipedia page on being in time, you would know that. Anyway, how do we get to Dugin? We're lagging a little bit, but okay. The Dugin introduction. It was Alexander Dugin who accomplished the particularization of Heidegger's concept of Dasein. Not exactly sure what particularization there means. Maybe you have an idea. Thus allowing for it to be put to work in productive, even practical ways. And he does this by returning to the beginning of metaphysics in Logos. And then he says that this is stepping outside of the West, which is where, Logos, I guess, is not a Western concept, and Alexander Dugin is not Western.
That's what I thought I was saying earlier, was that Heidegger left Dasein a bit too, monolithic and amorphous. So it's like general as opposed to particular. And he says at one point, moving from the general to the particular is kind of what we want to do here, and not just be sort of stuck in the universal. So I guess, Dugin comes in and helps us get a more particularization of this, which I read as meaning, different civilizations have different logoi. And he says, like, a state reflects the logos of the civilization, or you can judge I guess you can judge the efficacy or the success or whatever. You can judge the quality of the state based on how well it reflects this logos, this civilizational logos. That seems to me just to be tied to its origins, kind of like a root. It's the rootedness in Heidegger.
We're going from I hate identity politics to civilizational identity politics. Now we have different ontoses. That's why we can't get along here.
Yeah, we have the collective identity now. We don't have the Western bourgeois individual identities. Now we have a kind of communal-based sort of identity politics. Yeah, I think that's what's going on.
Now, HAZ doesn't draw this, and I don't know if Dugin does because I haven't read enough Dugin, but when Heidegger's talking Nazi, he does say stuff like, the German spirit is the greatest inheritor of the awakening of being, which was the Greeks. So there's a line from the Greek revelation of or disclosure of being for the first time through language. It gets somehow to the German spirit. I'm thinking, why don't you just do Heidegger properly? The logos is singular. You might call it something like the background structure that gives rise to language. And why is it self-identical? Well, that's because it means you can have like a genetic inheritance of languages. Languages can evolve, languages can be translated and yet maintain a certain presence. The same thing, being, shines through whichever language world you are in, and you can have different language worlds. Obviously, that's true. Otherwise, he wouldn't describe the Greek language world as the superior one with respect to its taking up of the question of being. So I have not read Dugin on why the logos should be pluralized by geographic area or civilization, but at least that's why he said Heidegger would not condone the effort to do that.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting too, just thinking back to him saying with the German spirit, him saying with so society is objective, I guess. The social is something objective. It's not just something subjective, I guess. It's not something you just subjectively either choose to identify with or not, right? This is, if you've heard the concept of like imagined communities, right? This is a concept that, well, a scholar named Benedict Anderson comes up with, but that's not important. The idea is that the origins of nationalism, you can trace them back to things like the printing press, right? Which allowed people who are otherwise very separate in time and space to have conversations with each other and start building up a collective identity. But I think in that view, you know, collective identity is just something in each of our individual heads. And you don't really have an argument there saying, you know, well, society is still something like objective and real and has its own laws of development. It's just a collection of individuals. So that's the thing we have to sort of argue against, is to say, no, it's not, yeah, sure, you have an imagined community, but you're also like a part of a real socius, a real social body that has a logos, right? I think that's the point here.
But I don't know if this is actually something Heidegger would disagree with, because the speaking comes after the logos, and then obviously there's going to be very different speakings. You can have the same logos and have it emerge in every different way. Why is it so important that specifically the logos is different? Like the structure of language is different. Is it different? Is it different civilizationally? Because if you have different values down the line, like everyone would agree with that, including Heidegger. I don't know why it's so important to say there's like an ontological difference between civilizations, unless you are down the line headed for some nationalist project, which is potentially the strategy here.
Which is what's happening here. Which is kind of what's happening here, yeah.
Yeah, or even what we were reading before with Schmidt. It just seems like it's an existential question. Like politics is about existence, right? A struggle between us and them. And we need this internal unity, because if we don't have internal unity, then we become weak and we fall apart because of infighting. And so, you know, you need this, yeah, I don't know, you need something that unifies, like a national project and an external enemy. But I don't see how that leads down the road to some kind of communist uprising. It seems very exclusive and Darwinist and combative.
Yeah, I don't know. This is tiring. I guess, yeah, we're basing ontology on our feelings now. I think that's what it boils down to. Very masculine, right? Okay, let's try to get this done. Then HAZ brilliantly says that we need to leave Heidegger, and instead of reading Heidegger, we're going to go read Dugin quoting Heidegger's essay on Heraclitus. I don't know if HAZ knows that Heidegger wrote the essay that Dugin is citing here.
Well, that's fine.
But he says, Logos is the revealed form of Dasein, cleansing Heidegger of any trace of potential subjectivism, which again is extra funny because he's quoting Heidegger himself saying this. Oh, here it is.
Stuff.
Dugin's geopolitical orientation allows for an understanding of the objectivity of civilizations beyond the formalism of statehood. States only exist to the extent that they can reflect the underlying logos of a civilization, reflected in its geography. So I don't know. We're changing the dressing. We're changing the furniture in the room, and we're still inside a room that Heidegger would have, or that did articulate just fine, which is your understanding of language is going to determine the revelation of being, but being itself is not particular. It's not geographically located. It's not. It doesn't suffer distinctions prior to its being spoken. Its spoken is being itself, existence, or I shouldn't say existence, but in common English.
Well, yeah, in Heidegger, logos is the forgetting of being. But in Dugin, it is the logic of a, quote, it is the logic of a given civilization's existence, defining its particular Dasein or ontology.
Wait, does Dugin say it's logic?
Well, no, this is 139, section 139. I'm not sure if it's what Dugin's words are to that. But yeah, for HAZ's Dugin here, it's the logic of a given civilization's existence. And so it's particularized. It's also spatial. It's not just temporal, like, being and time, Heidegger's book, right? Like being is temporal. He temporalizes being in the second half of that book. Dugin apparently adds like a spatial dimension, which is where that you just read a quote and you mentioned the geographical kind of specificity there too. So, you have, I guess now we have like Mediterranean civilization, we have Eastern Russian civilization, we even have our own North American civilizational origins here. And so there's also space now too. Dugin that's what he says here in 142. Dugin offers space as a proper counterpart to Heideggerian time, because he does not mind being metaphysical in the sense of grounding being in specificity. So
that's the other thing. He keeps saying Dugin is being metaphysical, but he doesn't really mean it. Yeah, he's been shitting on metaphysics the whole time, and then Dugin's being obviously metaphysical, and Haas is willing to forgive that one.
Yeah, I'm not even sure about the status of metaphysics by the end of it, but yeah, Dugin then comes into some criticism later on after Haas introduces Dugin's concept of chaos, which is like a counterpart to logos. So now instead of being, you have sort of chaos, which is the nothing that's excluded, right? The nothing that logos excludes and doesn't recognize. In fact, from logos's perspective, chaos is just nothing. But Haas says, but chaos isn't nothing. It is something. It is just like a chaos of indeterminacy. And then when Dugin comes in for some criticism, it's because chaos is now left as some kind of singular mass. It's not pluralized sufficiently, or it's not diversified internally. Quite.
He's just adding more metaphysics then. That's like simply what's happening. Here's a Heidegger quote. This is Heidegger saying exactly not to do what's happening here. The theory of being and the determinations of beings as such becomes a theory that investigates the categories and their order. The goal of ontology is the theory of categories. But at bottom, this is strange. It becomes intelligible only when we grasp that and how logos not only separates itself from physis, which means nature, but at the same time comes forth over against physis as the standard setting domain that becomes the place of origin for the determination of being. So you have to have Dasein there to articulate or to let being unconceal itself. And this tends to be violence. And that violence can occur in a poetic way, which is what Heidegger turns to for the last 20 years of his life and says, hey, everyone, do it this way. Do thinking, do poetry, let being come through language. Sounds kind of horny. Or you can just go back and do metaphysics and put categories and words on things, which is, again, metaphysics and the bad way.
That seems like a good point. I don't know how much more you guys wanted to talk about, but that seems like a pretty good point to finish on.
If we're going to finish, we have to read the apex, the purpose of all of this philosophical waxing is 181. They are wisdoms because of what they encompass in scale. You can make up your own retarded LGBT identity from scratch, but it is not tested before the wealth of possibilities, outcomes, and experience of human life compatible with a civilization shared by others. So, the purpose of resetting Dasein, remetaphysicalizing it in a geographical location, is that you can't make up your own retarded LGBT identity unless everyone else says you can.
Yeah, it's like two before that one, like 179. It's like, okay, after 178, he seems like he's gotten far enough, and then 179 begins with wokeness has nothing to do with the Marxist outlook. You can bullshit, all caps, all you want by referencing academic bullshit. In China, there is no wokeness. In the Soviet Union, there was no wokeness, because Soviet Union's presumably not a thing anymore. And it finishes, their cultural reforms they did have had nothing, all caps, nothing, in common with it. So their cultural reforms, the Chinese cultural reform had, for example, had nothing to do with wokeness, but I guess the implication is America is gripped in policy proposals that are all based on being more woke and accommodating whatever wokeness, Black Lives Matter, LGBT. And in China and the Soviet Union, there was none of that shit. When they did their cultural revolution, it was for non-woke purposes.
If we had just read the end first, this would have saved so much time and mental energy, because the end is you're allowed to overhaul all of the modes of production of an entire civilization as long as you don't do it wokely. Now I feel like I'm giving them too much credit. I was worried they're actually going to read the Recta Strata and then talk about the design in the soil or the heartland of design in the American worker. I'll give you some MAGA communists. I'm going to give you some anti-wokeness Heidegger for free. When the spiritual strength of the West fails and its joints crack, when this moribund semblance of a culture caves in and drags all forces of confusion and lets them suffocate in madness, whether this will or will not happen depends solely on whether we, as a historical spiritual people, still and once again will ourselves, or whether we no longer will ourselves. Each individual participates in the decision even when, and especially when, he evades it. But we do will that our people fulfill its historical mission. You can do all sorts of shit with that.
What's that from?
Recta Strata.
Oh, yeah.
One thing I thought was funny, too, is this logic of reproduction thing he goes into as well. This is also 180. A logic of reproduction develops on its own terms and only in ways that are compatible with the reproduction of units of civilization itself. Hierarchy of respect, family life, and culture all reflect objective wisdoms about what human life is, passed through generations.
Anything you want it to mean, as long as it's not woke.
So you're just doing that. You're doing these rhetorical moves while you're interpreting this serious philosophy. And what do you get out of it? And then the logic of reproduction thing is very strange. To know, he says again, a couple paragraphs later, to know a logic of reproduction is to know what is most sacred, fundamental, and ontological for a given people. So all the things Marx was saying about capital and how political economy works is this sacred, fundamental, and ontological whatever, what is most of those things for a given people. And so we're saying this Western metaphysical tradition, today it looks like capitalism in Western Europe and North America is a given people, and this is their logic of reproduction through money. And we need a different one.
So you just swap them out. Just put in your own.
Yeah, we need a different one that has all of these like sort of traditional wisdom elements, the hierarchy of respect and family.
I think you're onto something there. I think you've actually lined up a kill shot. Because just understand how arbitrary that is, right? Different civilizations have produced norms, and those norms are going to be included in the proletarian future, except for woke, which is anti-norm, because woke denies the hierarchy, the respect, family values, whatever you just said, that is passed through generations. So it's just normal conservatism, except that it's tied to something called civilization. And he tries to make this materialist in 147. I think this might have been what you were quoting, when he says a civilization is a specific logic of communal reproduction. That's it. And he shot himself in the foot there, you know? He's opened up the floodgates, because if we accept the plurality of logoi, an indefinite number of logoi, and you can call anything a communal reproduction as long as they've reached some minimum arbitrary threshold. So guess what? Philosophically, now we can have a woke logos defined by its own communal reproduction. We can have a gay and a trans logos. We can have an autism logos and a Taylor Swift logos. Why not? As long as look at 169. As long as they recognize their own humanity and the humanity of other civilizations, then they have to be mutually recognized. So thank you to the great HAZ. You have just invented identity politics again.
Exactly.
Yeah, I guess
a multipolar world.
Learn your lesson. I mean, they're already doing conservative identity politics, demanding their particular recognition. So you go woke, you go broke.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's just masked.
Yeah. Space is malleable. Yeah. It could be small. There's my apartment actually has different logoi in each room.
Yeah. So, even if this whole thing wasn't just a shitty reading and bad philosophy, maybe it's just me, but aesthetically, it's profoundly unappealing.
Yeah, I know.
I would do the revolution if this were the only option, right? If they are the true vanguard, I guess I'll be there. But to think that I have to get involved alongside a bunch of suit-wearing kids who think that these internet pick-me boys are paragons of masculinity.
I mean, I feel like when I was pretending to be a MAGA communist, I was making arguments that like don't need any of this esoteric philosophy and make a lot more sense, in my opinion.
All right. Well, check out our Patreon if you want to hear some more. We did an episode on Schmidt last week. Anyway, that's it from us. See you guys. Thanks.
Later.
All right. Bye.